Hello and welcome to my channel. This one is going to be a landscape in colored pencil, and I'm going to draw a moonlight scene with some trees. I'm going to have some hills in the distance, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the line of the horizon above them with this pinkish color. This is salmon in the Faber-Castell range, because the sky there is going to be a little bit lighter and a bit more pinkish. Now the surface I'm working on is a 1000 grit sandpaper. It works pretty well with colored pencils, but it has its limitations, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. After that, I started laying down some of the colors for the sky, which I was planning to use. I started out with a very light color, which is a sky blue, and then I put in a little bit of light ultramarine on top of that, and quickly I realized that this, even though I like the colors, this may be a little bit too bright, a little bit too light for that moonlit sky. So I'm going to put some darker tones in there eventually, especially at the top, because I want to have a bit of a gradient from top to bottom, where at the bottom near the horizon the sky is going to be a little bit lighter, and like I said, we're going to have a little bit more of these warmer pinkish tones. So I put in a bit of salmon and a bit of light beige, and I'm going to have to blend those fairly nicely, because you don't want to have texture and lines on your sky. You don't want to make it look distracting, because there's really no shapes there that we can see at such a distance, so it has to look smooth. The gradient has to look smooth. So the pencils I'm working on are Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils, and like I said, the surface is a 1000 grit sandpaper. Here you can see I started putting in some slightly darker, stronger colors like this ultramarine, which is like a cooler bluish color. At the top I'm going to put in some even darker blue colors, but you can see that this layering process takes a bit of time, and I'm blending usually, or most of the time I'm blending with tortillons, but that doesn't really cover large areas very quickly, so you have to be patient. So one thing that you'll notice on this surface is that even though the colored pencils do blend, and they do blend better than, or they layer better than they layer on regular paper, because the surface is rough and it grips onto the pencil, onto the material so well, it can be a little bit difficult to cover those larger areas, especially if you want to blend them smoothly, which is why this will require a bit of patience, and this process will be a lot slower if you used, for example, pastel pencils. So if you want to combine pastel pencils with colored pencils, that's also another way to do it. It can work, and I've done that in a couple of other videos, but here I wanted to use mostly colored pencils, so I went with those, and that meant that the sky is going to be done a little bit slower than usual. With pastel this would be a lot quicker, obviously, the whole blending process and the layering process. But like I said, colored pencils do have some of the advantages of their own. They're very good for smaller details, they're very good for precision, and that's really going to become noticeable once I start working on some details. So you can see I covered most of the sky here, and the colors are a little bit different now, and I'm going to be modifying it as I go along, but at the bottom I'm going to have to keep putting in those warmer colors. And I also added a few touches of other colors like this turquoise, because I wanted the color of the sky to be just a little bit warmer, so I added that greenish touch to it because I felt that it was a little bit too cool. And then I started working on the rest of the sky here at the bottom, using that combination of light beige and salmon, which I used initially, and then of course blending that in so that there is a smooth transition from those pinkish colors to the bluish colors. And of course I also had to cover the right side of the sky, even though I'm going to have some trees there. Now I'm going to draw the moon, and it's mostly going to be very bright, which means that I'm going to use a white colored pencil, but the thing is that it also has to have some pinkish tones in there as well. I want it to glow with a slightly warmer light, and to do that I'm going to combine the same colors that I used at the bottom near the horizon, and work with on top of that with a white colored pencil. Maybe add a touch of yellow, but mostly these pinkish tones around the brighter middle. And here and there I'm also going to draw a few stars, also using a combination of white and that salmon, so that even the stars are glowing with that warmer light. And I want to have some stars a little bit larger and brighter, others a little bit smaller and maybe less conspicuous. And I'm just going to scatter them all over the sky, especially the top part of the sky. And then once I've refined the appearance of the moon, I'm going to move on with the right side of the scene, and as I often do in many of my landscapes, I'm just going to slap a huge tree in the foreground. So that's my foreground element, a nice large tall tree, which is going to obscure one part of the sky and one part of the background. What this does is it helps to create contrast and tension between the foreground and the background, and also it helps me create a feeling of depth, because when I draw a darker and more detailed, more textured element like this one in the foreground, it's just going to push the other elements in the background a little bit further back, or that's at least the feeling that I want to give the viewer. So as for the color of the trunk, it's mostly going to be very dark, but not completely black. The middle part, especially a little bit to the right, is going to be darker because that's the shadow side, which is further away from the light source. This left side, which is facing the light source, is going to be catching a little bit of that light from the moon, and that's why I went over this left edge with a light beige, which is a very bright warm color, or at least warmer than the sky. And then I put in a little bit of cinnamon, which is a bit darker, but it works because I need something a bit darker as I make these marks, which are a little bit closer to the shadow side. So the very edge, which is facing the light source, needs to be the brightest, and I think that now the tree, because of the way that I shaded it, looks well integrated into that scene, because it's picking up that light from the moon. And now I'm drawing some branches, and of course I'm going to draw a canopy on top of that as well. Maybe some smaller dead branches or stumps of these branches along the tree trunk. And then at the top I'm going to draw canopy, which, because this is a coniferous tree, is going to consist of clusters of needles. So I'm going to try to draw them in the way that they often grow on coniferous trees, and like I said, I want to group them into clusters, and I want to have the tip of that branch just sort of curving upwards a little bit, but most of them will be drooping down because they're kind of long and heavy. And I want to have a few more here at the top. So I want to have the top part of the sky obscured by that canopy, and I want to have a bunch of overlapping branches, needles, clusters of needles, and smaller and larger branches. Here I started adding some smaller details to some of those branches and clusters of needles. I even added a touch of this warmer color so that it looks like even some of the branches are catching a little bit of that light from the moon. I did a bit more refining on the top part of the tree, and then I started adding some more branches and some more clusters of needles behind the tree, like maybe this is a part of another tree behind it, and these are just a little bit further away but very close to this tree in the foreground. And I made these a bit lighter and maybe a little bit less defined in terms of texture and detail. So I want to have a lot of overlapping branches because that gives that illusion of density, makes the trees look more realistic. And maybe some suggestions of tree trunks or another tree trunk on the right, to the right of the tall one here. And then I'm gonna draw another slightly smaller tree here to the left, because this one is obviously a little bit further away, and this one is on a slope that is just behind our tree in the foreground. So if you look at those distant mountains or hills, I want to have some, how should I put this, overlapping hills in the distance so that I can convey that feeling of depth and distance to the viewer. And the slopes which are closer to us are going to be darker and more defined, and the ones which are further back, further away, are going to be getting lighter and lighter and less defined. So that's my plan, and that's how I plan to imitate the atmospheric effect and the illusion of distance that you have when you're looking at when you're looking into the distance when you're in nature. So like I said, this tree here on the left is a little bit smaller because it's a little bit further away from our point of view. And here I'm just adding some more details to the tree trunk, adding a little bit more texture, some more details to that tree bark, and some lighter details here and there where the tree bark is catching some light from the light source or the moon. So that this left side is a little bit warmer and a bit more reddish in terms of color than the right side, where I put in some bluish tones. The right side is darker because it's the shadow side, but it's also a bit cooler. And once I was happy with the amount of detail on the right side, I was ready to work out the shape of those hills. But another thing that I did here on the right, I did a bit of softening of some of those shapes behind the tree in the foreground, because I wanted the textures to be a little bit more subdued so that they wouldn't compete with the tree in the foreground in terms of detail, and so that they wouldn't draw the focus away from it too much. So now onto these hills, and I'm going to use some bluish colors that I used for the sky, but I'm also going to use some slightly darker colors like this dark indigo, which is like a really dark blue color. And I'm going to use my blending tools, my tortillions, to work out the shapes of those hills. And like I said, I'm going to make some of them a little bit darker than the others so that it feels like they're in front of the ones which are further in the distance, so that the viewer can get some kind of an idea about the shape of that terrain in the distance. But here at the bottom, this whole foreground area, because it's very close to us, it's going to be much darker and more defined, so I'm just going to make it a lot darker using a black colored pencil. So you can see after the difficult and slightly tedious beginning where I had to shade the sky, things are going a little bit quicker here and a bit more interesting because now I get to play around and try to create an illusion of detail in the foreground. Another thing that was kind of helping me a little bit was the color, the background color of the paper, which is kind of like a bluish gray and a little bit darker, so it works for the scene that I'm trying to create. But if you have to put lighter colors on top of that darker background, it takes quite a bit of effort to overcome that slightly darker background color. But you know, here it worked. I suppose it was a little bit easier because the colors of the sky were a little bit more similar to the color of the paper. I'm adding some details here in the foreground, like some tree roots which are exposed here, and I'm making them a bit brighter using that cinnamon colored pencil, because I want some parts of those roots to be sticking out and catching some light from that moonlight, just like the left side of the tree trunk. And I'm also putting some illusion of detail into the grass as well, by putting in some greenish details, like a really dark green, and maybe a few touches of brown here and there as well. So I want the foreground area to be just a little bit more interesting, both in terms of color and in terms of detail, even though I'm not really sure how much of it you will be able to see because it looks pretty dark and I don't know how much of it the camera will pick up. I'm pretty much wrapping things up here as I'm working out some of the details, and I'm going to put my signature here in the lower left corner, and then the drawing is going to be finished. So let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now, for longer videos and more content, as always, you should check out my Patreon. So that's my Moonlight landscape in colored pencil. Thanks for watching, and I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye.